Okay, welcome back, everyone. We'll get started with our last speaker in a sorts. We'll come back. PHMSA will be back up here, but I'd like to kick off our final speaker for the conference before Steve Nanny and Ken Lee get back up here. But just to give you a little bit of background, I was talking to Carl Weimer, who's the executive director of the Pipeline Safety Trust, about public involvement in our meeting over the last day and a half, and kind of zeroed in and were intrigued by one of his board members who was working on a paper, Sarah Gossman, who's here today to join us. I was very intrigued by that, and I thought I just jumped at the opportunity to bring Sarah in to talk about some work she's doing at the University of Arkansas. I thought it's very relevant to our conversation, and definitely someone we want to stay in touch with as we go forward outside of this workshop. But Sarah, as you can see up here, is assistant professor at the University of Arkansas School of Law. She also happens to be vice president of the Pipeline Safety Trust. And again, Sarah's here to talk about a paper she's working on that I think you'll find very intriguing. So without further ado, Sarah, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Alan. All right, is this the clicker for me? All right, good. So I want to thank PHMSA for having me here. So a law professor, if allowed to speak about a law review article, jumps at the chance, right? How many people want to sort of listen to ideas in a law review article? But I think you'll, or at least I hope you'll be interested. As Alan mentioned, I both teach, I'm a law professor, and I'm also on the board of the Pipeline Safety Trust. And what I'm going to talk about today is my legal research, so as an academic. I'm working on this article, and these issues around risk analysis, risk communication, and risk management, these are the things that I'm interested in, the regulatory design pieces and the communication pieces with the public. So I think this might be a little different than the other presentations you've heard over the course of this workshop, but hopefully ties in a little bit and brings a different perspective to some of this set of difficult and thorny questions. All right. So as a law professor, and as somebody who thinks about policy, I think about risk analysis as basically an informational device. So then it happens that the question is, right, who are we providing this information to and for what purpose? And the who piece, right, is regulators, industry, and the public. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see the purpose of risk analysis being in the IM world. So as I understand it, really the risk analysis is to provide the regulated industry with information that it can use to assess operational risk. And I think secondarily, to provide PHMSA with the information to oversee industry response to operational risk. So you have both internal risk management as well as enforcement and compliance. One thing it doesn't do, to my knowledge, is provide the public directly with any risk information. So there are a couple issues that I see with this. One, from the law side, is that there's no standard, right, in terms of what the acceptable risk ultimately is. What's the end game here in terms of risk analysis? And the second issue that I see is it's difficult to enforce for PHMSA because of the discretion given to the industry to conduct the risk analysis. So what's the result of all that? So one result that I've been playing around with the data on is that this risk analysis so far at least hasn't led to the expected decline in significant incidents in HCAs. So here are a couple graphs, and I am a data nerd. I love to play with data, and PHMSA has some great data on their website. So this is data on hazardous liquid pipelines, and the yellow or gold is within could affect HCA areas, and the red is outside. And this is per mile, right? This is rate. And so what you see over the course of 2004 to 2014, if you run the numbers, is that we're not seeing a decline in the rate within could affect HCA areas, which is counterintuitive. If we're doing the risk analysis, why would that be? I ran this as well for gas transmission. As you can imagine, it's a little bit harder to do this because just in terms of the numbers, there isn't that much within the HCAs to play with, but here's what you end up with. And I guess what you can say is, well, there's a lot of jumping around, you don't see a consistent downward trend. All right, so that's number one. I think number two is that this information hasn't led to what the cost-benefit analyses told us was the reason for risk analysis, which is an expected decline in social costs from the incidents. So when I say social costs, I mean here deaths, injuries, both monetized by particular numbers that the Department of Transportation applies to those harms, plus whatever the other damages are, the property damages, loss of product. So I don't know how many of you have read these regulatory evaluations or impact statements. They're very interesting, and they give you a sense of why you might do policy, right? So the big reason to do IM and to do risk analysis was to reduce social costs. That's the benefit in the world of cost-benefit analysis. So, to my knowledge, nobody has done this, right? Which looks at the social costs as they've actually occurred over time in implementation versus what was expected at the time that the cost-benefit analysis was prepared. And what you see is that the total costs, here we're looking at gas transmission, are much higher than the estimate, in part because the benefits were quite dramatic. The expected benefits were quite dramatic. The regulatory evaluation estimated that the IM rule would reduce social costs by 75% of the historical average. So to give you all and PHMSA some credit, right, that's a pretty hard standard to meet. And not surprisingly, it didn't happen. All right, the other graph I have here relates actually to gas distribution. And again, here I had data both prior to implementation and post-implementation, and you see that total costs, the gold, are above the expected social costs, which are the red, right? So that was expected to be the reduction, and what we see, and again, it's just a couple years, but social costs that are higher. So again, when I say social costs, you should be thinking monetized deaths, monetized injuries, plus property damage. All right, what else? You all know this, the public continues to be concerned about pipeline safety. The IM and risk analysis so far has not convinced the public that pipelines are as safe as they might want them to be. How might we know this? I don't know if you ever play around with Google Trends. I think it's a really interesting thing to play around with. So if you actually put in pipeline explosion as a web search into Google Trends, it will tell you how often. So this is actually, what this shows you is between the least and the most, right, of possible searches. This doesn't tell you absolute values, it tells you relative values. So we're not seeing here actual numbers of searches, but we're seeing that first of all, there were searches as it relates to pipeline explosion by the public, and also, maybe more interestingly, right, when those searches occurred. So, again, not particularly surprising, public is concerned, is putting in pipeline explosion into the Google search device, and is looking particularly around the times when we have these high consequence, low probability events. The risk communication literature, and I know that PHMSA's referenced this before, tells us that media coverage of these particular types of events tends to focus people on the events and also causes them, in the absence of other information, to think that these events happen more often than they do. This is called a heuristic device, and this is the way people think about risk. All right, what if you put in pipeline spill? So pipeline explosions, we might relate to natural gas, pipeline spills, liquids. Well, here I think it's pretty interesting that we really don't see that many searches until Marshall and the Enbridge spill there, which, by the way, was the spill that got me interested in pipelines. I was living in Michigan at the time, teaching at Michigan Law, practicing environmental law. And then Mayflower, the state I currently live in, right, and Yellowstone. So this also gives you a relative sense of searches. So you'll see that more people are searching around gas explosions than they're searching around spills. I think, again, not a particularly surprising result. People are more worried about explosions than they are perhaps about liquid spills. But there are some spikes. How else might we know that people are concerned about pipelines? I thought this survey was incredibly interesting. So this is from the University of Texas, Austin. They do an energy poll. You might know of it. This one's from March 2015. And they asked the public what was their top concern regarding Keystone XL pipeline. When I teach Keystone XL pipeline, I talk about climate change because that's the issue that I think about with that particular pipeline. That is not what the public thinks about when it thinks about the pipeline. It thinks about things like hazardous chemicals, water contamination, right? And environmental degradation, which is a broad term. But when they are specifically asked between environmental degradation and climate change, they pick environmental degradation. So isn't it interesting that this really controversial set of issues around a pipeline framed much about climate change, right, in the environmental community, ends up for the public still being about risks, traditional risks of pipelines. And here about spills. All right, so I want to suggest a couple solutions or things to think about, I guess, in light of the information that I've shown you. So one, I think, is following on to a lot of what you've already heard, which is I'm certainly in the more rigorous analysis camp. This is in part because I am interested in human health risk assessment. I've taught a lot on that and toxics law, so I think about probabilistic risk assessment a lot, and I think it has a lot of benefits. Of course, one benefit is that it forces gathering of more data, both on external and internal risks. And I think both of these things would be very helpful. But why are they helpful? What is that actually going to do to change the game? So I think they're helpful if something else happens, and that is we reconsider the purpose of the risk analysis and the information that comes out of it, as well as the audience. So right now, we're focused mainly on internal risk management by pipeline companies with oversight by PHMSA. And I want to suggest that risk analysis, more rigorous risk analysis, can actually inform the PHMSA side and specifically can inform a standard, right? A regulatory acceptable risk. Now, acceptable risk is a loaded term, both on the environmental side and I would guess on the regulated side as well. So what do I mean here? You know this, but you probably don't realize how unusual it is. The Pipeline Safety Act is one of very few statutes that have a requirement of net benefits, that benefits have to exceed costs in the statute. Extremely rare, lots of discussion around cost-benefit analysis, but as to the statutes themselves, that is extremely rare, right? Came in under the Gingrich Congress. And so that itself makes acceptable risk the standard because we're not looking to go to zero. We might want to get to zero, and I think that's a good goal. But the statute itself tells us that we need to weigh the benefits versus the costs. And because there are always going to be compliance costs, and compliance costs are high, we're never going to get to zero fatalities and zero injuries and zero property damage, at least in the world that I know right now, based on the particular statute. What can we get to is some sense of what the risk should be. And I think that's what I want to propose. What else do I want to propose? That we provide the risk information from this heightened analysis to the public. Now, I want this to be clear as to how I think this happens, right? So there are two types of informing the public. One is to tell them, look, you are overestimating the risk. Here's the real risk, don't worry. So that's not the kind of particular risk communication device that I'm suggesting, and it's not one that you probably would think simplistically happens, but it does happen. I mean, there are great examples in the nuclear side and the chemical industry side about people who were certain that if they only gave the numbers, that that was going to solve the problem, and risk communication literature and a ton of studies tell us that that's not how people think, and in fact, that drives them further away. So what really we're trying to do here is provide risk information to the public in a form that helps them make their own decisions based on their own sense of acceptability of risk. So what's a concrete example of this, right? Somebody who wants to buy a property that's near a pipeline. There's the regulatory standard, say if PHMSA were to define some form of acceptable risk. The person who's buying that property may agree with that standard or may not, but is going to decide on whether to purchase that property based on the information given to them around what the risk is. That is, they set their own acceptability of risk and they make the decision based on that. So here are the benefits as I see them about these particular approaches. The benefits to the agency, well, it makes decision-making about risk transparent. And actually, I think that fits in quite well with why we might have cost-benefit analysis in the statute. That is, we're trying to be clear about what the costs and benefits are of regulating pipelines. They have important products. They do critical things for our economy. They also have costs, right, in terms of injuries, deaths, property damages. Being clear about where we have set the line on that particular risk is beneficial to the agency because people trust the agency more. It improves PHMSA's oversight of the industry as well because now we have a standard, and lawyers love standards, preferably very bright line standards. And it provides the data needed to measure the benefits of regulation. So when you are able to calculate risk and also calculate reductions in risk, now you have data to support why you might take a regulatory action. This is particularly important because we're now waiting on, two major rules that are currently, well, I think, held up by OIRA in a cost-benefit review, right? So having data that supports the benefits of regulation as well as the costs, is critical to actually getting out rules that both give industry certainty and give the agency the ability to act. What about the public? So here, it provides individuals with risk information that, as I explained, right, they use to make decisions based on their determination of what is acceptable, and ensures that individuals can participate in the democratic process of setting and revising regulatory standards. I'm not naive enough to think that we can educate every single concerned citizen about the complex technology around pipelines, right? But I think we can do a better job of giving them the basics around why we might make decisions around risk with pipelines. And this, I think, is really important for our democratic process. All right, I end with this because I think it shows you exactly where you don't want to go. That is to the extremes. So you have one person who says, look, no harm, right? Not doing anything wrong. On the other side, the person says, prove it, right? We know you're doing something wrong. Risk analysis and the types of solutions that I've proposed try to get us to that middle ground. That is, we know there's some harm. We also know that we're going to have to live with it to get the benefits that we get. And the prove it piece is the risk analysis. So that's the methodology question. And that's my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sarah. We have time for, looks like we're a tad ahead of schedule here, so we have time for a couple of questions. So again, step up. Okay, Jim, we'll get a mic to you, Jonathan. And again, to those on the web, feel free to submit your question via the link that's provided.
This is on, right?
Thank you. Jonathan Perez from the Environmental Defense Fund. Finally, we have a lawyer presenting, so I can actually understand what's being discussed. So what I wanted to get your comment on, Professor, is we've been at the Environmental Defense Fund and working very collaboratively with utilities on distribution leaks. And there's two things that have arisen that I think have significant public policy implications. Number one, we started out at a point where many utilities were saying that even the locations of their inventory of leaks were subject to, were confidential and the public was not entitled to know. We've largely been able to overcome that by demonstrating that as a matter of law, methane emissions are air pollution, and therefore the public has a right to know under longstanding Clean Air Act law. But the second issue is a little bit more vexing, which is that the hazard indexing algorithms and programs that are being used by utilities to get qualitative, to prioritize and get a qualitative understanding of risk with their existing leak inventories are not made public. And in fact, most utilities, due to their vendor relationships, are not able to share those. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts, pursuant to this notion about public, how to address these issues with the public, about whether there's a public policy interest in members of the public that maybe is of superior interest to the right of utilities to keep those hazard assessments confidential. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
So it's a tricky set of issues, and I think that you've articulated them very well. And I think, so there are a couple ways to approach it. I think one is to do what you said and say, look, we have public policy concerns here around risk and ensuring that we have information for people who are affected by pipelines, right? And that should be the priority. Maybe more practically, because I'm ultimately a pragmatist, although maybe didn't come across as one in this presentation. I mean, I think that there are ways of taking the analysis and packaging it in a form of risk communication. I mean, that's what we do in the EPA world, right? So I think it's possible to do that too and still provide people with good information. And one thing I didn't say in my presentation, but I'll take this opportunity to say, is that if you look at the risk communication literature, people aren't necessarily scared of numbers. That is, they understand numbers. They might want different types of numbers. They might not want individualized risk. They might want numbers of fatalities based on total population exposed, right? But the problem around numbers and estimating numbers comes in a world in which you have a vacuum around what the risk is, right? So I think packaging the results of that risk analysis for people to understand, that's a great job for PHMSA to do, actually. And I mean, that's what I would think they could do to help. So maybe, yeah, that's where I'd leave the pragmatist side.
Well, indeed, we're doing that with One Utilities.
Yeah.
Is depicting it in a way that's comprehensible.
Right.
For regulators
And of course, yes, and of course nonprofits are also classically in that position, right, of translating the scientific and technical knowledge for people who don't have that. And I think that's a perfect role for nonprofits.
We have a question from the internet here.
We do have a
Yeah.
question from the internet. People were wondering if, when looking at your data, you were taking into account the increase in population and new pipelines, and especially on the liquid side, the large increase in HCA mileage that came about because of the changes in populations and things like that.
Sure. So the mileage, the HCA mileage, definitely, because this is a rate. So I had to input the HCA mileage for each year. Population independent of that, no, right? So I think there might be arguments that over time, the social costs might have gone up based on just the reality of, say, a growing population around particular pipelines. That's not the estimate that was made in the regulatory evaluation, the cost-benefit analysis. So when I'm trying to compare it to what we thought was going to happen with IM, I'm trying to compare it to what was thought at that particular time. My inclination is that that doesn't completely get us around the problem of not having the kinds of benefits that we thought we'd have out of IM, but yeah.
Yes, I'm Alton Payne. I'm with the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement. And I have two questions. One with my engineering hat, which is your charts on social costs were interesting, let me say. Where did you get the data that you used to monetize the social costs?
Right. So I used the monetization that was used in the regulatory evaluation. So I think it's 5.8 million for fatalities, and I want to say like 500,000 and change for injuries. And then the property costs that are directly reported in PHMSA's data.
Okay. And my second question is, have you considered that internal rulemaking is really a tool to educate the public? And have you considered that in the process that you're proposing?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that the rulemaking process, and I teach administrative law, right? So you can't help it when you're teaching environmental and energy law. But absolutely, I mean, rulemaking is ultimately about democratic participation as well as expert judgments around what the rule should ultimately be. It's not traditionally a great device for risk communication in the way that I think the literature supports the idea that we need to do more in terms of communicating risk to the public. There might be a way to do that through rulemaking. It just hasn't generally tended to happen.
Right, but that would be a good vehicle as well, I assume.
I think so.
Yeah.
I
okay.
think so.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yes, sir.
Hi, Marty Sadison, Director of Nuclear Safety and Regulatory Research at the DOE's Idaho National Laboratory. In one of your later slides, you mentioned the benefits of risk assessment for PHMSA being some transparency in decision making, and also some information on benefit of regulatory actions that are taken.
Right.
That made me think back to some of your early slides where you saw the difference between the projection and the reality of previous implementation of IM, for example.
Right.
So could you comment on, obviously the track record wasn't very good on being a predicting tool. And so what would have to be different for that to actually give you some
Right.
valid input?
Right. And again, to not make it too hard on PHMSA, right? This is a common problem in regulatory evaluations. This is not unique to PHMSA. It's quite difficult, I think, in many situations to try to calculate these and estimate these. But I guess my argument is that by actually establishing a standard that is creating an acceptable risk as a particular standard, we have a better chance of figuring out both that standard, where we are now, and where we're going to get to that standard, and that gives us the benefits calculation. What we didn't have at the time that the IM rule came out was that particular standard. So what we were doing is taking historical data and then saying, we think that it's going to be 50 to 75% better. And I'm not exactly sure where those numbers came from. Maybe PHMSA could tell us, but I think they were operating in a bit of a vacuum in terms of what IM would actually do.
Okay. One of the things, having acceptable tolerance or acceptable risk standard
Right.
Can lead people and the conversation between the regulator and the regulated into a battle of numbers, right? If you say 10 to the minus 6 and you come in at 1.01 times 10 to the minus 6, that's not acceptable, 5.99 or whatever times 10 to the minus 7th is. And so you end up in that kind of discussions a lot. And in a lot of cases, that's not beneficial because in the big picture of things, the uncertainty drowns all that, and you're close, and it still ends up being smart people making smart decisions. So that's just a caution.
Yeah, and I take that point, and I think, well, there are a couple things that I think need to happen before you would get to that place. And one is obviously better data and more rigorous analysis. That's not going to solve the entire problem. The other thing that I have been thinking about in terms of my law review article and would love feedback on is whether you can set acceptable risk in terms of, say, like 10 to the negative 4th to 10 to the negative 6th, right? So some range as opposed to a particular bright line number to avoid the very problem that you're talking about. And I think that EPA informally does that in some of the risk assessments that they do and the ways they think about, say, toxics. But I'd love examples, if there are any, of whether that works.
One of the related cost benefit that's come up a few times is one of the challenges of, and it's not unique to PHMSA, it's to any government agency as you do those things, is the data you have and the limitation of data. We can't just say, go out and get data that would be nice to have a more accurate cost benefit. We're pretty much limited to what we have and what we're authorized to collect. So to collect more, we have to go through a deliberative process to gather that information. So oftentimes the challenge is to work with what you have to develop the best cost benefit you can, and many times it can be a bit fuzzy. And we're looking, in hindsight, we're not looking ahead, we're looking at what we can prevent. We're not looking at the benefit of the change going forward, but what we've prevented looking backward. Yes, Mark. Yes, we have maybe one other after this.
Hi, it's Mark Stevens with Seaford Technologies. I enjoyed your presentation. I really appreciated your comments on the merits to establish acceptance criteria for all the reasons you've indicated. And as someone who's been kind of advocating that approach for a long time, it's nice to hear it coming from someplace else. I guess my question is, how practical or realistic do you think that is to happen? Because frankly, my experience is it is not the North American way to prescribe acceptance criteria and put them out there. It seems to be happening in other jurisdictions, but not here. Do you think realistically that's going to happen?
Well, this is the joy of writing a law review article. No, I mean, the reason I'm here is that I don't just consider it to be an academic argument. I really want it to happen, right? I mean, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to explain why. But So one answer to your question is, it does happen in environmental law. So, and that's sort of where I guess my training comes from, right? So when I teach toxics law, we're able to talk about risk in that way. But I also take the point that in the world of pipeline safety and sort of safety, more sort of safety-focused regimes, right? It's a different, somewhat different set of issues. So the one, I mean, I've been looking at other countries, and you all would probably know this, but I've been looking, for example, at Great Britain and the way they think about issues, which has been very influential in terms of how I have come to this acceptance world. So to me, the fact that other countries are doing it seems like a good indication that it's possible to happen here.
Okay, last question.
Katie Helfrich with Excel Energy. Thank you for your presentation, first of all. And I really appreciate you bringing in a bigger focus to educating the public and making them aware of the risk discussion that we're having. My question for you, and I think it's something that we can't ignore, so I'm interested in your perception on this. As operators that are in highly regulated environment in terms of setting our return on equity and then rates for our customers, can you comment on where that comes into play in your observation and your position of tolerance of risk from the public and what they're willing to pay for that, quite frankly?
Right. So in my ideal world, the fact that we would be better risk communicators would mean that we would also be able to convince people that increases in rates for purposes of safety is a good idea. I think that I can make that argument, right? I mean, I think that it is possible to imagine a world in which we really could communicate why these particular costs are important to safety in a way better than what we're doing, and that might really influence the utility rate making process. I teach utility rate making. I think that there are a lot of people who really don't want to see increases in rates, and probably the best risk communication in the world is not going to change their minds on that. So I'm practical about how far you can go. But I'd like to see us try, right, to really do, and a lot of this is not just my ideas, right? This really comes out of a whole set of literature, which you may or may not know, that relates to how best we communicate around risk. And there's a ton of really interesting stuff out there, and it's been talked about for a while, and I think it really could be applied in great ways in this context.
Okay, well, again, Sarah, thank you very much. Appreciate your remarks today, and I thought they were very relevant and fit nicely with the conversation we've had over the last couple of days. So what we'll do is we'll go immediately to the next panel. So I'll call Steve Nanny and Ken Lee up, and then I'll be back at the very end to wrap up and summarize where we are. So, thanks.